Welcome to an episode of the Habit Chess podcast. My name is Misbah Hawk, and on the show, I like to talk about high agency thinking and skill acquisition. If this is our first time crossing paths, quick background about me. In 2016, I started my first podcast out of my childhood bedroom, and within a year, it landed me my dream job coaching Fortune 1000 executives and professional athletes. I also have gone on to launch shows that have done over 1 million downloads and become successful client acquisition channels. And now I write about and talk about high agency thinking and skill acquisition on this podcast and on my newsletter called Habit Chess as well, which, by the way, make sure to get signed up for that in the description below. But in today's episode, I'm very excited to be breaking down a book called The Alter Ego Effect by Todd Herman. This is a book that I discovered in July of 2019. And the thing that pulled me into diving into this book in the first place was I was doing stand-up comedy and I was looking for a way to be my best self on stage, right? The days that you didn't feel like going on stage, the days that you didn't feel like you quite sounded like yourself. How do you tap into that consistent character on stage? And it reminded me of something that I used to use when I was competing in Olympic weightlifting. It was something I learned from a sports psychology class where how do you tap into the athlete that you need to be in very high stakes situations? In Olympic weightlifting, if you're not familiar, you only get 3 attempts per lift, and there's only 2 lifts in the sport. So essentially, you've got 6 chances to accumulate the best total, the highest total that you can. And if you miss out on that, if you don't have a good meet, it's often sometimes a month, 2 months, 3 months before you're back on the platform and getting to take another 3 to 6 attempts. And so when I started stand-up comedy and I was trying to discover the same thing, this book came across my radar. And it had a bigger impact on me than I could have expected. By the way, this is what I love about breaking down books on this show, is I don't always just do them a week after I read it or the first month that something comes out. I like to wait years sometimes and look back on books that have stood the test of time for me personally, because some of the ideas that transcend life and all the things that you've got going on and you're doing and all the new books you've consumed, all the new media and content that has come your way, what has actually stuck? And so for me, I'm going to start with sharing the lesson that I learned in the world of Olympic weightlifting and the Superman effect. So this was from a sports psychologist. It was my professor in the sports psychology class. I had a really big meet coming up in Connecticut, and I remember what she shared with me was to find a moment of transition, right? So for example, when you are changing your shoes, okay, so you're going from your normal running shoes or whatever into weightlifting shoes, okay, it's a moment where you're lacing up and you feel like, okay, I'm about to step into kind of the version of myself. The session is beginning, right? My practice session is about to roll. The next trigger that I used to look at sometimes was actually taping my wrists. So being able to tape my wrists with athletic tape was actually another very therapeutic, and it was a task that felt like a trigger, right? You're looking for this trigger that is going to get you in your mind to go, okay, cool. I'm no longer the Misbah of the day, whatever I was doing. I'm now Misbah the lifter, right? And the reason this is important to pay attention to is because it will tie into some concepts in the book, right? Looking at the shoes that I'm wearing or the tape that I'm putting on or the notebook that I log my workouts and my reps in, those were things that would signal, okay, we're switching environments, we're switching contexts, and it's time to perform, right? It's almost like a primer, because of course, when you're putting your shoes on and you just got to the gym and maybe you just had work or whatever, and you're like, you're not quite in the zone yet, right? It's like task switching, how they say, is one of the most costly things to your productivity, because switching contexts, it takes so much out of your attention that it takes quite a while. It takes several minutes sometimes to be able to get back into the flow of things, right? Even if they were both, let's say, on the computer, but if they were vastly different tasks, your brain feels a little tougher to dive right back into the thing, versus if you're batching something, that's a little bit easier to keep going. But that big transition from going from a different context, whether it was coaching or work or whatever else, into diving into my weightlifting session was a big moment where you can step into this version of yourself, right? The next thing was actually finding the trigger during the lifts as well. Okay, so when you are performing the snatch or the clean and jerk, there's approaching the bar, because there's a whole, in that community, it's like your mindset kind of, the way people approach the bar and get set up and they grip the bar and they like to be really calm. Some people like to get really aggressive, right? Whatever your thing is, that ritual or routine before the bar even leaves the ground is very important for channeling the version of yourself that you want to. And so now let's dive into the book, okay? Because that Superman effect was something that I was thinking about the whole time that I was reading the Alter Ego Effect. And what I loved getting to learn in that book was how some of the biggest people that Kobe Bryant to Beyonce, all had their own version of this, right? I believe even Chris Rock was an example. And for me, starting in a new world, starting in stand-up comedy and trying to be the best version of myself every time I was on stage was just as high stakes as Olympic weightlifting was, because you only get 6 attempts in an Olympic weightlifting meet, right? You only get 5 minutes at a time on stage when you are a new comedian. And if you're in a city that really loves stand-up comedy and it's a very active community, you can probably do that 2, 3, 4, 5 times in a night, but that's mostly New York or LA, right? Places like Philly, where I was, maybe I would get 2 sets in one night. So ultimately it's 5 minutes times 2 is like, wow, that was a great night. I got 10 minutes of quality stage time in today. And so I never wanted to waste seconds in that stage time doing something that was like, I'm gonna be so annoyed after I'm off stage, because I'm gonna be thinking the whole time about how I gotta wait another 24 hours or 48 hours before I get to go back and try that joke again, or try the real version of what I wanted to say. So this doesn't just apply to comedians or people who are athletes, right? This applies to anyone who is trying to step into a better version of themselves when the moment calls for it, right? So this could be in a variety of scenarios. And that's what I loved about the Alter Ego Effect, was Todd Herman was very recognizing of the fact that different situations need this, right? So for example, if you are somebody who is a very high functioning executive, right? That is something that, okay, maybe your field of play is not actually work, right? You're pretty good in that environment, but the field of play that you want to improve in is maybe parenting. You want to be more present as a parent when you get home from work, right? That was an example I remember him using, and he used that to describe this concept called the totem, right? And so the totem is basically the same way in Inception, right? Where they have the little spinny thing, and when it keeps spinning forever and ever and it doesn't actually topple over, that they're in a dream. But if it does topple over, then okay, we're in reality. And so it immediately reminded me of that concept, and I was like, oh, that's cool. And so for this executive, the pants that he would wear, so when he would come home, probably wearing nice suit pants or something like that, right? For him to actively take his pants off and switch into a pair of dad jeans, like they were particularly and purposefully not cool looking jeans, he labeled them dad jeans, had the impact that he needed to be like, okay, the Superman effect, right? I'm now about to step into my field of play, right? I'm now reminding myself, I'm giving myself a cue that can allow me to step into this version of myself. Now, of course, this takes some time, right? So another example of this was Todd Herman, the author, sharing how he uses glasses as his totem. And he doesn't even wear prescription glasses. He just has a pair of frames because when he puts them on, he feels smarter, right? Now, is that factually true? Are you actually smarter when you put glasses on? Probably not, right? But the whole point here is that it has personal meaning to him, the same way that for the executive, the pair of pants seemed to have some significance and meaning and really trigger his brain to go, oh, I'm switching zones, not at work anymore. And so what I remember about this totem, okay, was that you do not want to tell anybody what yours is. And so I'm only going to share with you today what mine was, because I've switched the totem. I do not use that one anymore, but I'll give it to you just as an example of how I was using it back in the day. And so for me, when I would step on stage, you typically know there's one or two other comedians in front of you. So you're like, okay, I'm on deck. I remember I would have this coin. Okay. It was Ryan Holiday actually sells these. They're like the stoic coins, right? So the obstacle is the way, or ego is the enemy, or, they had different things written on. I think one of them that I had was amor fati, right? Which stands for not only to bear what is necessary, but enjoy it, or something like that. And it was like a gold coin. It was like this big, right? And I would carry it in my pocket, and I would put my hands in my pocket and squeeze this thing as hard as I could, right, in the palm of my hand, as my name was being called up, as I was getting introduced, or as the previous comedian was wrapping up. Because I remember one of the moments, right, one of the moments of fear when a comedian does really well before you is, oh man, like it's a lot to walk into, right? You want to ride off that wave and energy. You don't want to kill it completely, because that happens too. It's hard to follow somebody who just crushed it, right? And so I remember, okay, getting over that fear slowly but surely by basically making sure to tap into that squeeze in my pocket. But at the same time, what makes the totem meaningful is the personal attachment that you might have to it. So the same way for Todd, how it was his glasses and it makes him feel smarter. And so when he goes on down in a big meeting or something like that, he will put on a specific pair of glasses, and it seems to evoke the things that he wants them to evoke. And you want to find your own version of this. It doesn't need to be expensive. It doesn't need to be huge. The simpler, the better. But really what it is, figuring out ahead of time, okay, what is the identity that I need to step into? And I think the other thing that might be helpful to note here is that you are not being someone else, right? So you're still you. Because I remember sharing this book or this concept with somebody a year or so after I had read it, and I remember them kind of being dismissive. It's already so hard to be yourself. I can't worry about being another person. And I was like, you don't get it. Like, it's not you being somebody totally different. It's when you are talking to, let's say, your boss or a coworker, okay, you're going to speak to them a little differently than maybe you would if you're talking to your friends, right? Versus maybe your kids, versus maybe somebody you're meeting for the first time, versus maybe your childhood friend since the third grade, right? There's just this thing that happens when we speak to different groups of people, or we are in different environments that dictate how we might speak and how we might behave, right? So you want to try to find the identity that gives you the feeling of home court advantage, right? So an example of this is barbers are so just outgoing. They talk a lot, like they're great conversation, right? I always admired that about my barbers. And so I remember in my barbershop, like this owner, this barber was just like, it was like his home court advantage, right? He felt really comfortable there. He would talk to everybody. He would make a lot of people laugh. It was just a great vibe. But now when I saw him in a line at the grocery store or something like that, right? He was not being the same barbershop funny dude that he normally is, right? He was at the grocery store getting groceries just like I was, and probably, was just in a totally different environment. And I remember seeing that, like how different people can be and feel. So ideally you have something in your mind already that allows you to pull and tap into what is the best version of yourself in this situation look like. So for example, in stand-up comedy, I did not Actually, I'm thankful that I did have a couple great performances earlier on that gave me the visual memory in my brain of, oh, that's what the laugh feels like. That's what it sounds like, right? And I remember, okay, a year later, maybe I did a set that got the kind of laugh that was like, I had never gotten that before, right? The kind of rolling laughter where it's not one, but two, but three. And then, oh my gosh, it's still going. You can feel that kind of laugh in your chest, right? In year one, when I read this book, I didn't have that context of, oh, that's what I'm going for, because I hadn't experienced that kind of thing on stage yet, right? But I knew I wanted more laughs, right? And so you can begin to visualize that. But what I encourage you to do is the second that you have a moment in whatever you're doing that you experience, oh, that's what I want it to feel like. And so in a Olympic weightlifting context, when I would nail the snatch in such a way where I was like, yo, that the way I pulled myself under the bar, the way it clicked, the way it sounded, I just know the way that it looked on camera and stuff too. I nailed that. That felt how it should feel when you perform something as intended, right? All the technique, everything was just nailed perfectly. You want to take a moment to crystallize that in your brain. You really want to, before you start making it an intellectual exercise, what did I just do that made that work? You want to take a second to really absorb, what did that feel like, right? Like, how do you personally feel? How great do you feel? What did you do different? How were you, what was your state before you approached the bar, right? How did you handle the feeling of the bar being heavy? Because the bar is heavy. No matter how strong you get, you're obviously pushing yourself more and more. And so that feeling of, oh, this is heavy, that doesn't end. You just continue to like be able to withstand that thought until you get to the next phase of the lift. So that part is pretty essential. Make sure to crystallize whatever version of success you want to feel, especially when you are lucky enough to experience it. Because now you have something that you can begin to mentally rehearse to some extent in terms of the outcome that we're going after. So remember, this is an identity shift, right? The alter ego isn't inventing somebody that's fake. It's stepping into a version of yourself that already exists. The other concept from this book that stuck was the idea that when you create this alter ego and you step into it, it allows you to remove judgment in a way that you may not if you are just looking at it as fully yourself. Because with stand-up, again, as an example, when I would be on stage, you are trying to be as yourself as you can, right? But at the same time, when something doesn't go as intended, so maybe your opening joke didn't hit or didn't get the laugh that you thought it would get, right? All of a sudden, what that can do when you're on stage, you're like, oh, your brain is just like paralyzed. You're like, wait, I thought they were going to laugh at that. And then now you're overthinking about the fact that they didn't laugh at that, right? Which is going to affect, oh my gosh, I don't remember what my second joke was. What was that? Instead of falling into that trap and getting sucked into the overthinking in the moment when something does not go exactly as intended, which we all probably know, when then you begin to judge yourself, then you begin to overthink more, and it just is a downward spiral for performing the best that you can in a given moment. So the alter ego effect allows you to stay in that state so that the critic and the performer are separate, right? So you've got the performer and then you've got the critic, and you do need both, right? But you cannot have both that exist at the same time. That was something that a mentor in comedy told me once, right? So while you are trying to perform, you cannot, like, you trying to critique yourself while you're doing it is going to inhibit like the best of what can actually come out of you, right? It just never will, because there's all this thought and chatter that's going on. The best moments on stage and in a lot of things in performance is when you're in flow, right? There's a total absence of thought. It's just happening. And so this tool can really help you get over imposter syndrome in situations where you have it and it drowns out the real stuff that you want to say or do. So anyways, once you have this idea of what the best version of your performance and you can actually look like, that's what the totem is designed for, right? The totem is designed to trigger that entire character, that entire personality in the moment that you need it. And what I really connected with about this was in situations like being on stage, like Beyonce was actually a very shy person, and her coming up with her version of the alter ego effect is what allowed her to be the beast that she is on stage when she's performing. And to me, it's very comforting when I hear people like, wow, Kobe Bryant felt this way and he thought this way too, right? Chris Rock has his own version that he deals with that you just wouldn't expect. And so I think that many of us may even have a version of this that we do subconsciously, but to actively, consciously develop an alter ego version of yourself, especially for a field of play that you are trying to get very good at, right? For me, it was stand-up. For me, it was Olympic weightlifting. Nowadays, honestly, it's even sitting down talking to you, right? When I'm sitting down and doing this, I want to tap into the best version of myself, right? I want to sound like myself. I don't want to sound like someone else. And so your version of that could be a number of things, right? It could even be the way that you present at work. Okay, when you do presentations, you might hate it because, hey, 80% of people hate public speaking and it's their number one fear, right? Yet, many of us have to do it in a variety of scenarios. So that is a field of play that you could apply this to, but I encourage you to find something that's more meaningful and that feels more direct and immediate, right? Just like that executive who wanted to be more present at home. And okay, there was some incentive there to actually care about this and to actually implement some of these pieces from the book. So I hope this was useful. Find your totem. That's one of the things I recommend you doing. Pick the field of play that you want to actually improve in, and then begin to draw upon the identity that you need for those moments, right? And try to really experience that if you can, even if it's just once, even if it is literally for 5 seconds, because that's how it was in stand-up. It's, you caught it. You caught the wave for 5 seconds. You got that crazy laugh. And then it's like, oh man, I can't replicate it. I can't experience that again, right? But once I know what that feels like, okay, I'm never going to forget it. And that was such an awesome feeling and effect from doing what I did, where it was like, okay, now I need to just rehearse that 100 times in my mind, because you want to normalize that. You want to normalize getting the effect that you are going after. And then the other thing I would say, because this was really important in stand-up, but I think it carries across to a lot of other mediums and genres, is that you can use the alter ego effect to prepare for failure and for your responses to failure. Because like I mentioned, you're typically drawing upon, oh, this is going to be the best. How will I sound when I'm crushing every single joke, right? And I've got the whole crowd. Oh man, it's going to be perfect. And then the second that you go and actually do it, when that first joke doesn't hit as you anticipated, or in the Olympic weightlifting concept, my first and second lift I miss, despite in my mind it was perfect, that can rattle you, right? That can go, oh my gosh, this doesn't work, or this isn't working. And then you're even more stressed, right? So one of the components I recommend doing for the alter ego effect is practicing what will be your response to failure, right? So I just remember, what will be my response when the bar is heavy? And I remember this famous world-class Olympic weightlifting coach saying that it's supposed to feel heavy, right? Like, it feels heavy for me too. It feels heavy if it doesn't feel heavy, you're likely not pushing hard enough in that moment where you're trying to push as hard as you possibly can. So the heavy factor is that it feels heavy for all of us, right? But how do we continue to trust that, hey, even though it feels heavy and scary, if I just get it past my knees, I'm going to be all right, right? And you want to tackle all of the intrusive thoughts that are going to be coming your way, especially the ones that seem to completely ruin your performance, right? Because that can. Lifting the bar off the floor, it feels heavy. You're not going to have the momentum to take the lift the rest of the way. But hey, if you've already practiced and rehearsed your response to that, I bet you're going to deal with it a lot better. Same thing with missing a lift totally. How do you compose yourself? How do you gain mental control back? And how do you reapproach and crush that lift, right? And so I hope this was useful in giving you a tool. I definitely recommend reading the full book, The Alter Ego Effect by Todd Herman. I'll link that in the description below. Make sure to check that out. So anyways, I hope this was useful. I know I shared it in a couple different contexts of how I'm using the alter ego effect. Hopefully you thought immediately of a couple different areas where you can implement this into your field of play. Your next step is now picking out a totem that you already have that's easy, right? Like for example, the coin that I used to use in a stand-up context, it was easy because if I was wearing something or, there was some other object that I was using, it may be too noticeable, right? And it may be too disruptive. Like other comedians would notice it or other people would be like, what is that? The fact that it was small, it was in my pocket, and it was able to trigger the version of myself that I wanted, That was cool. And I definitely recommend reading the full book to get deeper insight. If you enjoyed this concept, I think you'll get a lot out of it. But if I could describe to you what you're trying, and you're going to feel your own version of this, but for me, what I was trying to do was the way that like you almost feel like when I would squeeze the totem, that I could feel like, okay, my whole, like the energy throughout my whole body, I have a cloak. I'm a different version of myself now, right? The version of myself that's the critic. I'm not seeing that person for the next 5-10 minutes. We're going to talk later. I hope this gave you a couple strategies that you can take with you, that you can immediately implement, because it has definitely been useful for me, especially after half a decade later. So I wanted to make sure to share that with you, because there's all sorts of new books and stuff that I'm reading, which will be featured on the show as well. But I don't want to forget the titles and the classics that did wonders for me in the past, because it can be easily forgotten. And this is a gem that if you care about performance and if you care about tapping into the best version of yourself and maximizing your potential, you'll be drawn to this book. It's something that I think you'll get a lot out of if you found this video so far pretty useful as well. So anyways, thanks for hanging out. Drop a comment if you enjoyed this. And of course, make sure to download the free tools and all that good stuff that I have in the description below. I appreciate you taking the time, and I will see you on the next one.